The doors of the Ascendancy Parliament had not opened for a human in 14 years, and when they opened now, nobody had authorized it. Consul Arvethi Marn was mid-sentence when the seals disengaged. He had been reading the final clause of the permanent exclusion decree, the instrument that would strip the Terran cooperative of its last observer credential and close the parliamentary record on humanity's presence in galactic governance forever. The clause was 7 words long. It would take him 3 seconds to finish. He did not get those seconds. The doors split along their center seam with a pneumatic hiss that sliced through the chamber's acoustics like a blade drawn across glass. 1,200 delegates turned in their tiered seats. The recording apparatus embedded in the dome's lower ring swiveled on magnetic bearings. The holographic seal of the Ascendancy Parliament, rotating in slow amber above the central dais, flickered once as the chamber's environmental systems registered an unauthorized biosignature crossing the threshold. The biosignature belonged to Alara Vaz. She walked the center aisle without hurrying. She was 61 years old, tall and angular, with deep lines around her mouth and iron-gray hair pulled back from a face that looked like it had been shaped by someone who valued function over decoration. She wore a dark navy coat, collarless, cut close at the waist, with no insignia, no rank markings, no embassy seal. The Terran cooperative had not maintained an embassy in Ascendancy space since the expulsion vote. Her shoes were flat-soled, practical, and they struck the polished quartz floor with a cadence that carried through the chamber's vaulted ceiling like a metronome, counting down to something the gallery could not yet name. 14 years. 14 years since the Ascendancy Parliament had voted to expel humanity from the Interstellar Compact. 14 years since the vote had passed with a margin of 11-1, the single dissent coming from the Varenthi delegation, whose representative had cast her objection, and then resigned her post the same afternoon. 14 years since Alara Vaz, then serving as the Terran Cooperative's senior parliamentary liaison, had been escorted from this chamber by 4 Severathi security officers, and told that her transit credentials had been revoked, her diplomatic immunity dissolved, and her name added to the exclusion registry that barred listed individuals from entering any Ascendancy-governed facility, port, or transit corridor. She had not argued. She had not protested. She had walked out, and the doors had sealed behind her, and the Ascendancy Parliament had continued its session, as though the seat at the far left of the gallery's ground tier had always been empty. Now she was back. The aisle was 90 meters long. She used every meter. The chamber was as she remembered it. The tiered seating, carved from the pale quartz that the Severathi quarried from their planet's equatorial ridges, rose in concentric semicircles from the central dais to the gallery's upper rim. The glass dome, 40 meters across, flooded the space with Severath Prime's diffused daylight, a cool blue-white illumination that the Severathi considered ideal for deliberation, because it suppressed the circadian fatigue responses of 8 of the 12 member species. The environmental systems maintained a temperature of 16 degrees standard, and a humidity level calibrated to the midpoint between the Keithrani's aquatic requirements and the Chelesh's arboreal preferences. The air tasted of filtered mineral, a faint limestone tang that Alara associated with every significant memory she had formed in this room. The negotiations she had facilitated, the crises she had managed, the afternoon when 4 Severathi officers had flanked her and informed her with institutional courtesy that she was no longer welcome. She remembered that afternoon with the particular clarity that humans reserved for moments of acute injustice. The officers had not been unkind. They had been procedural. One of them, the senior, had offered to carry her personal effects to the transit platform. She had declined because her personal effects consisted of a single data pad containing 6 years of diplomatic notes and the stylus she used to annotate them. She had carried both out of the chamber in her coat pocket, where they weighed almost nothing, which was disproportionate to the weight of what they represented. The stylus was still in her coat. Not this coat. The coat she had worn 14 years ago had been recycled at a Terran outpost 7 years later when the environmental filters had failed and all non-essential textiles had been converted to supplementary filtration material. The stylus had survived because Ilara had placed it in a drawer before the recycling began, and because humans had a tendency to preserve small objects that represented large losses, a tendency that the Varenthi understood instinctively, and that the Severathi had never understood at all. In the gallery's 9th row, a Pelori trade analyst was watching the human walk and thinking about shipping corridors. The Pelori analyst had spent the last 3 years tracking anomalies in interstellar trade flow, the kind of anomalies that showed up as statistical noise in quarterly reports, but resolved, over longer timeframes, into patterns. The pattern she had identified was this. In the 14 years since humanity's expulsion, 16 minor species had signed bilateral trade agreements with the Terran Cooperative, all of them in corridors the Ascendancy had classified as economically marginal. The total trade volume of those corridors had increased by a factor of 7. The atmospheric processing output of the Veshan corridor alone now supplied 31% of the rare compounds the Ascendancy's shipbuilding industry required. The Pelori analyst had written a report about it. The report had been filed. It had not been discussed. She was thinking about that report now because the woman walking the center aisle was the woman who had built those corridors. Not personally, not with her own hands, but with the patient, methodical cultivation of relationships that humans practiced the way other species practiced warfare, slowly, deeply, and with an attention to decades rather than quarters. The Pelori analyst had never met a human. She had read their trade filings. The filings were meticulous, complete, and filed on time. In 14 years of exile, the Terran Cooperative had never missed a filing deadline with any of its bilateral partners. The Pelori analyst found this terrifying. Consul Marn's composure fractured. His secondary eye membranes, the translucent inner lids that Severathi closed when processing unexpected information, snapped shut and began flickering rapidly. He was tall and narrow-framed, skin the color of river sediment, a face built for institutional authority. That authority was confronting an event its owner had not modeled. "This chamber is sealed," Marn said. His voice carried the formal cadence of parliamentary address, but the undertone was wrong. It was the undertone of a man who had expected the next 3 seconds to be the simplest of his career, and was confronting the possibility that they would be the most complicated. No unauthorized individual may enter during a formal reading. Security will escort the intruder from the floor. 2 Severathi security officers materialized from the colonnade flanking the gallery's ground tier. They moved with the practiced efficiency of personnel trained to remove disruptions quietly and without spectacle. They closed on Ilara from both sides, their boots striking the quartz in synchronized cadence, hands reaching for the restraint bands clipped to their belts. Ilara did not turn toward them. She stopped at the center of the chamber, directly beneath the holographic seal, and spoke 2 words that stopped the security officers mid-stride. Article 9. The officers halted, not because the words carried physical force, but because they carried procedural force, and in the Ascendancy Parliament procedural authority outranked every other kind. The officers looked at each other. They looked at Marn. They waited, hands frozen above their belt clips, caught between an order from their consul and a clause from the founding compact that even the consul could not override. The chamber went quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a pause between speakers, but the structural quiet of a system encountering an input it had no protocol for. Article 9 was the Ascendancy Parliament's oldest procedural clause, written into the founding compact before 6 of the current 12 member species had achieved interstellar capability. It granted any former member state's designated representative the right to address the Parliament on matters of existential concern, provided that representative presented themselves in person before the formal record was sealed. It could not be refused. It could not be overridden by the presiding consul. It could not be diluted by amendment, because Article 9 predated the amendment process itself. It had not been invoked in 211 years. Most delegates had never heard of it. The ones who had considered it a historical curiosity, a procedural fossil embedded in the compact's bedrock, irrelevant to modern governance. Alara Voss had not considered it irrelevant. She had considered it the only weapon she had left. In the fourth delegation platform, the Dren representative's elongated skull tilted 3 degrees to the left. The Dren were the Parliament's living archives. Their species memory organ could recall the exact text of any document the Parliament had produced in its 400-year history, and the tilt was the posture they adopted when searching that archive. The tilt lasted 2 seconds. Then the Dren representative straightened and said nothing, which was itself a statement of considerable weight. He had found Article 9. It was real. It was binding. The silence said, "She is correct, and there is nothing the consul can do about it." Marn's eye membranes stopped flickering. They closed fully, held for 2 seconds, and opened. The Severathi equivalent of taking a deep breath before stepping off a ledge. Article 9 requires the petitioner to demonstrate standing, he said carefully, as though placing each word on a surface that might not support its weight. The Terran Cooperative's membership was dissolved by parliamentary vote. You have no standing in this body. Alara reached into the interior pocket of her coat and produced a single document. It was physical. Pressed cellulose fiber, ink-printed, bearing a wax seal that caught the light from the glass dome overhead and threw a red-gold reflection across the polished floor. She placed it on the podium scanner. No explanation, no preamble. The document spoke for itself, and she let it. The document's contents materialized in the holographic display above the dais. The chamber's translation systems rendered it simultaneously in 12 diplomatic scripts, the alien glyphs scrolling in parallel columns of cool cyan light. It was a credential letter, formally designating Alara Voss as the Terran Cooperative's Article 9 representative, signed by the Cooperative's Governing Council, dated 6 weeks prior, and authenticated by the Independent Verification Bureau, a body the Ascendancy Parliament had itself established 40 years ago to prevent credential fraud. The authentication seal glowed green, valid. In the gallery's 7th row, a Torvathi military attaché, broad-shouldered and dark-chitined, leaned forward. His compound eyes caught the holographic light in dozens of faceted reflections. He was doing arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of fleet tonnage or supply logistics, which was his profession, but the arithmetic of institutional procedure, which was the language this human woman had chosen to fight in. The arithmetic was simple. Article 9 plus a valid credential equaled a floor that could not be denied. He had arrived at the answer before Marn had finished processing the question. He folded his upper arms across his chest and waited, which was the Torvathi posture for watching something that was about to become very expensive for someone who was not them. Marn's jaw tightened. The Independent Verification Bureau has not been in active operation for 7 years. It was defunded by parliamentary appropriations in Session 41. This credential was authenticated by a body that does not exist. It exists, Alara said. It was defunded, as you say. It was reconstituted 3 years ago under Section 12 of the Compact, which permits any founding signatory to reactivate a dormant oversight body through direct petition. The Varenthi filed the petition. The Bureau has been operational since. In the second delegation platform, Seelith Khan, the Varenthi representative, inclined her head. The Varenthi were empaths, their species reading emotional states through dermal receptors on their palms. Seelith's palms were pressed flat against the stone bench beneath her hands, and through that stone she could feel the emotional temperature of 1,200 delegates shifting, degree by degree, from procedural irritation toward something more complex and more dangerous. The gesture was small. Its implications were not. The Varenthi, the only species that had voted against humanity's expulsion, had spent 3 of the intervening 14 years quietly rebuilding an oversight mechanism the Parliament had allowed to atrophy, and they had done it using the Parliament's own rules. It was not rebellion. It was maintenance. The Keithrani representative, an aquatic evolved figure whose facial structure made whispered conversation almost impossible, leaned toward her advisory and said something that carried clearly to the nearest recording apparatus. The wet clicking of her consonants was unmistakable. What she said was, "She has been planning this." Marn turned to the parliamentary clerk. The clerk was Dren, the same species whose memory organ had already confirmed Article 9's validity. The consultation was brief, conducted in the clipped exchange of officials who both knew the answer and were performing the ritual of verification for the record's benefit. The clerk confirmed what Marn already knew. The credential was valid, Article 9 was binding, and the only lawful response was to yield the floor. "The floor recognizes Alara Voss," Marn said. He did not add under protest, though his posture said it clearly enough that 3 species with different visual processing systems read the same meaning. He stepped back from the reading podium and took his seat on the consul's bench, a curved slab of dark stone at the chamber's eastern edge. His hands gripped the armrests. The stone did not creak. The Severathi had built their furniture from materials that did not betray their users' tension. His hands, however, were another matter. The knuckles were white. Alara surveyed the 12 delegation platforms arranged in a wide semicircle around the central dais. Each one was elevated on tiered stone, each occupied by a lead representative, 2 advisors, and a parliamentary scribe. The architecture was designed to make the person standing at the center feel surrounded, observed, and judged from every angle. It was supposed to be intimidating. Alara stood in its focal point as though she had been standing there for years and had simply stepped out for a moment to collect her coat. "I will be brief," she said. "This Parliament is about to seal a permanent exclusion decree that will erase the Terran cooperative from the interstellar record. I am here to present evidence that the original expulsion vote, 14 years ago, was conducted on the basis of falsified intelligence." She paused for 1 second, not for emphasis, for accuracy. "And that the continuation of that expulsion has been maintained through the deliberate suppression of information that this Parliament was entitled and obligated to review." The gallery tiers stirred. In the upper rows where the diplomatic staff and military observers sat, bodies shifted. A Dren scribe's stylus stopped moving. The Torvathi attaché's compound eyes had not blinked, which was notable because the Torvathi blinked reflexively every 12 seconds and 18 had passed. Marn's voice cut from the consul's bench. "Those are extraordinary claims. This is not a tribunal. Article 9 grants you the floor to address matters of existential concern, not to relitigate settled votes." "I am not relitigating," Alara said. "I am presenting evidence. What this Parliament does with it is its own affair." She produced a data wafer from her coat, thin and translucent, and placed it on the podium scanner. The holographic display activated. What appeared was an intelligence assessment, classified at the highest level of the Ascendancy's security apparatus, bearing the seal of the Parliamentary Intelligence Bureau. It was dated 15 years prior, 1 year before the expulsion vote. The assessment was titled, Terran Cooperative Strategic Threat Analysis. Its conclusion, rendered in the formal Severathi diplomatic script, stated, "The Terran Cooperative presents no strategic, military, or economic threat to the Ascendancy Parliament or its member states. Human military assets are defensive in posture and regional in scope. Human trade volumes are within normal parameters. Recommendation, no action." The chamber processed this in stages. First, silence. Then the slow turning of 1,200 heads toward the intelligence gallery, where 3 Severathi officers in formal gray sat in a row. Their hands were very still on their armrests. One of them, the youngest, had stopped breathing. The others could not tell because the Severathi respiratory system did not produce audible inhalation, but the slight pallor spreading across his sediment-colored skin was visible to anyone within 5 seats. Then came the murmur. It began in the Keithrani delegation and spread outward through the semicircle, each delegation adding its own harmonic of alarm. The Pelori delegation exchanged rapid glances, 3 vertical pupils per eye dilating in synchronized confusion. The Chelesh representative's 4 articulated limbs unfolded slightly beneath her ceremonial robes, the involuntary posture her arboreal species adopted when the branch they were standing on began to give way. Marn leaned forward on the consul's bench. The authenticity of this document has not been verified. It has. Alara placed a second wafer on the scanner. A verification report from the Independent Verification Bureau appeared, confirming the assessment's classification codes, file signatures, and chain of custody records. The green seal pulsed, valid, the same seal that had authenticated her credential, the same bureau the Varenthi had quietly resurrected. The infrastructure of accountability, rebuilt in silence while the Parliament had been busy pretending the silence meant nothing. The Pelori representative, slender and silver blue-skinned with 3 vertical pupils in each eye, rose from her platform. The Pelori were a diplomatic species. They traded in precedent the way the Torvathi traded in raw materials. If this assessment concluded that humanity posed no threat, she said, each word measured, then on what intelligence basis was the expulsion vote presented to this Parliament? Alara did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the chamber's air, let it do the work that a speech would have undone. 3 seconds, 5. The question replicated itself in 12 languages on 12 diplomatic feeds, and every second it went unanswered it grew heavier. Then she placed a 3rd wafer on the scanner. A second intelligence assessment appeared. Same classification level, same bureau seal, same title, Terran Cooperative Strategic Threat Analysis, dated 3 days after the first. Its conclusion was the opposite, word for word the opposite. The Terran Cooperative presents an imminent and escalating strategic threat to the stability of the Ascendancy Parliament and its member states. Human military assets have been concealed through systematic underreporting. Human trade networks constitute an economic subversion apparatus. Recommendation: immediate expulsion and permanent exclusion. 2 assessments. Same bureau, same classification, same title, opposite conclusions, 3 days apart. The murmur in the chamber became something else. It became the sound of 12 delegation platforms recalculating their positions simultaneously, the scraping of chairs as bodies leaned forward, the wet clicking of Keithrani speech, the low harmonic drone of Dren vocal cords processing conflicting information, the sharp intake of breath from species that breathed, and the flexing of spiracles from species that did not. In the gallery's upper tiers, a diplomatic scribe dropped her recording stylus. It struck the stone tier with a crack that echoed through the dome like a punctuation mark at the end of something finished. The Torvathi representative raised one armored hand. His carapace had shifted color, the involuntary chromatophore response his species exhibited under significant stress. Which assessment was presented to this Parliament before the expulsion vote? The second, Alara said. And the first was classified, sealed, and removed from the parliamentary record the day after it was filed. She placed a 4th wafer on the scanner. A chain of custody log materialized in the holographic display, its entries rendered in authenticated timestamps and authorization codes. The log showed the first assessment's reclassification, the authorization for its removal, and the name of the official who had ordered it. The name belonged to a Severathi intelligence director named Korath Palan, who had served as Consul Marn's predecessor's chief of staff. The name was known to every delegation in the chamber because the name appeared on the founding charter of the current parliamentary session. Korath Palin had drafted the charter. He had organized the transition of power from the previous parliamentary term. He had shaped the institutional architecture that every delegation in this room operated within. In the consul's bench, Marn's hands had gone very still. The knuckles, which had been white, were now the same sediment color as the rest of his skin, which meant the blood had left them entirely. The recording apparatus captured his expression, which was the expression of a man watching the structural supports of a building he had inherited begin, one by one, to give way under a weight they had been designed to conceal. The Chelesh representative leaned forward on her platform, her four articulated limbs unfolding into the posture her arboreal species used when tracing a branching consequence to its terminus. The chain of custody shows the reclassification was authorized by a single individual. Does the record show whether the full Intelligence Bureau endorsed the second assessment? Alara placed a fifth wafer on the scanner. Internal Bureau communications appeared, time-stamped and authenticated. 7 of the Bureau's 12 senior analysts had filed formal objections to the second assessment within 48 hours of its creation. Their objections cited methodological errors, unsupported conclusions, and the deliberate omission of data from the first assessment. The objections had been logged, acknowledged, and sealed under the same reclassification order that had buried the original analysis. The objecting analysts had been reassigned to peripheral postings within 6 months. 2 had resigned. 1 had died in circumstances that the Bureau's internal records described with institutional precision as inconclusive. The word inconclusive moved through the gallery like something physical. The Keithrani representative's gill slits flared. The Dren scribe who had stopped writing picked up her stylus and began recording again, faster than before, her hand moving with the urgency of someone who understood that the record being created in this session might be the most consequential text she would ever produce. Marn rose from the consul's bench. His posture carried the rigidity of a man shifting from defense to counterattack, the kind of institutional reflex that the Severathi trained into their political class from adolescence. These documents, regardless of their provenance, were obtained outside of authorized channels. The Parliamentary Intelligence Bureau's internal communications are classified material. Possession of classified material by a non-member representative constitutes a violation of Section 93 of the Compact's security protocols. I move to strike the evidence and adjourn for a security review. It was a competent maneuver. Alara recognized it because she had anticipated it. She had anticipated it because she had spent the last 6 years constructing a procedural map of every possible countermeasure the consul's office could deploy, and Section 93 had been the third one she had identified. It was also the weakest. Section 93, Alara said, applies to classified material obtained through unauthorized access to parliamentary systems. These documents were not obtained through parliamentary systems. They were provided by the intelligence analysts who authored the original objections, through personal disclosure, as permitted under the Compact's whistleblower provisions in Section 104. The provision was introduced 42 years ago, at the request of the Varenthi delegation, to protect analysts whose professional assessments were suppressed by institutional pressure. She placed a 6th wafer on the scanner. Authorization records from the whistleblower disclosure process appeared. Each of the 7 objecting analysts had filed personal disclosure forms. The forms were time-stamped, authenticated, and countersigned by the Independent Verification Bureau. The 2 analysts who had resigned had filed theirs from Exile postings. The 5 who remained in service had filed theirs through intermediaries whose identities were protected under the same provision. The disclosure process was legal. It was documented. It was, Alara knew, unimpeachable because the Varenthi had designed it, and the Varenthi designed legal instruments the way their species processed emotion, with total precision and no ambiguity. Marn's countermove died in the air. The parliamentary clerk confirmed, without being asked, that whistleblower disclosures under Section 104 were exempt from Section 93's classification restrictions. The clerk's tone was neutral, but the speed of his confirmation was not. He had been waiting for the question. Marn tried again. He had not survived 3 decades in Severathi politics by conceding after a single reversal. His voice found its formal register, the cadence that parliamentary officers used when invoking emergency procedure. I call for a recess under Standing Order 12. The Consul's office requires time to consult with the Parliamentary Intelligence Bureau on the provenance of these materials. The chamber will reconvene in 48 standard hours. It was a stronger play than Section 93. A recess under Standing Order 12 would pause the session, suspend the recording apparatus, and give Marn's office 2 days to construct a response, suppress the diplomatic feeds, and potentially reclassify the documents Alara had already placed in the public record. It was the institutional equivalent of pulling a fire alarm to stop a conversation. Alara did not counter it herself. She did not need to. The Dren representative's harmonic voice cut through the chamber with the precision of a tuning fork struck against stone. Standing Order 12 requires the consent of the floor when invoked during an Article 9 proceeding. Article 9 predates Standing Order 12 by 147 years. The hierarchy is unambiguous. The petitioner's floor cannot be suspended by a standing order that was written after the article that granted it. He paused, and the pause contained the weight of 400 years of procedural memory compressed into the processing organ of a species that forgot nothing. The Consul knows this. The 3 words landed like a verdict. The Consul knows this, not the Consul should know this, not the Consul may not be aware. The Consul knows this. The Dren were not accusing Marn of ignorance. They were accusing him of something worse, of attempting to use a procedural mechanism he knew to be inapplicable in a recorded session in front of 12 delegations whose institutional memory would preserve the attempt. It was the Dren equivalent of calling someone a liar, except that the Dren never used that word, because their species considered the concept of deliberate falsehood so fundamentally aberrant that they had no single word for it, only a descriptive phrase that translated roughly as one who speaks the shape of a thing that is not. Marn sat down. The motion was controlled, deliberate, the motion of a man who understood that every movement he made from this point forward would be analyzed, debated, and cited. He placed his hands on the Consul's bench and said nothing further. The nothing was louder than anything he had said since the doors opened. In the Severathi intelligence gallery, the youngest officer's pallor had spread from his face to his neck. He was beginning to understand something that would take his superiors another hour to process. Every exit from this room that the Consul's office might have used had already been mapped, analyzed, and sealed by the woman standing at the podium. She had not come with 5 documents. She had come with enough to answer every challenge the institution could generate. The documents on the scanner were the visible ones. The wafers still inside her coat were the ones that dealt with the counter-arguments. The Torvathi attaché in the gallery's 7th row unfolded his upper arms and placed them on the stone bench in front of him, palms down. It was the Torvathi posture for accepting that a structural assessment was complete and the results were final. He had finished his arithmetic. The human woman had not made a procedural error. She had not left an unguarded approach. The Torvathi attaché was a military logistics specialist. He recognized a prepared position when he saw one. This was a prepared position. Every line of fire was covered. The Dren representative spoke. His voice carried multiple harmonic layers simultaneously, as though several people were speaking in careful agreement. The founding charter of this parliamentary session was drafted under the assumption that the expulsion vote was legitimate. If the intelligence basis for that vote was fabricated, the Charter's validity is in question. Nobody contradicted the Dren. The legal implication moved through the chamber like a crack spreading through ice. If the expulsion vote was illegitimate, then every legislative act that rested on it, every trade sanction, every territorial reallocation, every diplomatic exclusion was legally suspect. 14 years of parliamentary decisions, built on a foundation that had just developed a fracture visible from every seat in the chamber. Ilara let the silence work. She had learned this discipline in the years of exile, in the small trade negotiations and quiet partnerships with species too minor to register on the Parliament's strategic calculations. Silence, properly deployed, was not the absence of argument. It was argument in its most concentrated form. It said, "The evidence is before you. The weight is yours now." The Morathan delegate stirred. She was the oldest being in the chamber, massive and stone-gray, her hide cracked with age lines that mapped her species' geological sense of time. The Morathan did not speak often. When they did, the chamber listened, because the Morathan measured political developments against the deep time of continental drift and stellar evolution, and their observations had a weight that shorter-lived species found impossible to dismiss. The Morathan had watched empires form and dissolve. They regarded the Ascendancy Parliament itself as a recent development, interesting but far from permanent. "How many delegations in this chamber?" the Morathan said, her voice a low rumble that vibrated the floor panels beneath the nearest gallery tier. "Were aware that 2 assessments existed." The question was not rhetorical. The Morathan were asking each delegation to account for itself, publicly, while the recording apparatus was running, and the recording would be permanent. A pause. The kind of pause that separates the moment before a vote from the vote itself, the moment when the intention hardens into the act. Then Seelith Khan stood. The Varenthi representative rose with the composed precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind for 3 years. Her luminous gray eyes were calm. Her palms, pressed flat against the stone bench, had been reading the chamber's ambient emotional state since the session began, and what she had been feeling was a slow, tectonic shift from institutional confidence towards something that had no name in Varenthi emotional taxonomy, because it had never occurred in a parliamentary setting within their cultural memory. The closest approximation was the feeling of a geological fault releasing centuries of accumulated pressure. The Varenthi delegation was not aware that 2 assessments existed, she said. Our predecessor, Representative Analith Dewar, cast the sole dissenting vote on the basis of procedural irregularities she could identify but could not substantiate at the time. She formally requested an investigation into the intelligence record. The request was denied. She resigned her post when the Parliament refused to review. She spent the remaining years of her life advocating for the reactivation of the Independent Verification Bureau, which she believed was the only mechanism capable of preventing this Parliament from becoming an instrument of the body it was designed to govern. She died 4 years ago. She was right. We now understand why the investigation was denied. The gallery was very still. The name Analith Dewar was not unknown in the chamber. She had been a fixture of parliamentary proceedings for 3 decades before the expulsion vote, a Varenthi diplomat known for her precision, her empathic acuity, and her absolute refusal to vote on any measure she could not independently verify. Her resignation had been noted and filed, and within 2 sessions forgot. Institutions, Ilara had learned, forgot dissent the way rivers forgot the stones they had worn smooth. The forgetting was not deliberate, it was structural. The Keithrani representative stood next. Water dripped from the gill slits along her jaw in the rhythmic pattern that indicated agitation. The Keithrani delegation was not aware. We voted on the basis of the intelligence presented. We were not informed that a contradictory assessment existed. We were not informed that 7 bureau analysts objected. We were not informed that the objecting analysts were reassigned. She paused, and the next words came with the deliberate cadence of someone entering a statement into a record she expected to be cited for decades. We voted in good faith on fraudulent intelligence. The Keithrani do not vote in bad faith. If this parliament allowed us to, the failure is not ours alone. One by one, the delegations began to stand. The Torvathi, not aware, his carapace shifted color as he rose, the chromatophore response rippling across his chitinous shoulders. The Dren, not aware. His harmonic voice layered the denial with overtones of institutional displeasure that made the younger delegates in the upper tiers flinch. The Pelori, not aware. Her three-pupilled eyes narrowed to vertical slits, the expression her species used when recalculating a position they had held for years and discovering it had been built on sand. The Chelesh, not aware. Her four limbs folded into the configuration that signified a branch point reached, a decision pathway irrevocably forked. 6 delegations standing. 6 species that had cast votes on intelligence they now knew to be fabricated, standing in a recorded session to say so. The Varethi delegation stood, 7. They were a species of burrowing physiologists who had joined the compact late and voted with the majority, because their trade agreements ran through Severatha-controlled shipping lanes. Their representative looked at Marn as he rose, and the look was not anger. It was the expression of someone discovering that the partner they had trusted with their economic security had not trusted them with the truth. That expression, more than any of the documents Alara had presented, was the one that would appear in the diplomatic analyses that followed this session. Trust, once broken in a recorded session, did not heal quietly. It healed publicly, or it did not heal at all. Alara watched the 7th delegation stand, and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What she felt was the sensation of a mechanism engaging. A mechanism she had assembled in darkness, in rented offices on stations that smelled of coolant and processed air, in meetings conducted through intermediaries because her name was on the exclusion registry, and direct contact with compact-affiliated representatives would have compromised them. She had built this moment the way her species built bridges, one structural member at a time, each one tested before the next was placed, the entire architecture invisible until the final piece locked into position and the span became apparent. The final piece was not a document. It was not a clause or a credential. It was the willingness of each delegation to stand, and that willingness could not be manufactured. It could only be created by presenting the truth and trusting the institution to respond to it. That trust was the most dangerous part of her plan, because it rested on a belief that the Ascendancy Parliament, despite everything it had done, was still capable of recognizing when it had been wrong. She had staked 14 years on that belief. She was watching it justify itself, one delegation at a time, and the feeling was not triumph. It was relief so profound that it registered in her body as a kind of stillness, a cessation of the low-grade tension she had carried in her shoulders and her jaw, and the muscles around her eyes for so long that she had stopped noticing it until, in this moment, it began to release. The Tsalari representative, whose species communicated through bioluminescent patterns on their facial membranes, stood without speaking. The patterns on his face shifted through 3 configurations in rapid succession: surprise, recalculation, and a final pattern that the Tsalari used to signify a debt acknowledged. His species maintained elaborate social accounting systems, and the standing was itself an entry in an invisible ledger. 8th delegation. 8 was the number, 2/3 of 12, the threshold. Alara had spent 14 years studying the Ascendancy Parliament's procedural architecture, with the patience of someone who understood that institutions were not monoliths but machines, and machines had specifications, tolerances, and failure modes. The specification she had found was buried in the Parliament's foundational compact, in a subsection governing the legitimacy of legislative acts performed under false pretenses. The subsection stated that any legislative act conducted on the basis of fraudulently obtained intelligence could be challenged by a two-thirds parliamentary vote, and that such a challenge, once raised, was automatically referred to the Judicial Review Panel, a body composed of retired adjudicators from non-member species whose rulings were binding and could not be appealed. Two-thirds of 12 was 8. 8 delegations were standing. The threshold was met. But Alara did not invoke it yet. She waited. She watched the remaining 4 delegations, the ones still seated, and she let the chamber's own momentum do the work she had spent 14 years preparing. Marn saw the count. He understood the arithmetic as well as anyone in the chamber, and he understood what the arithmetic meant, and he understood that the woman at the podium was waiting. She was not waiting for permission. She was not waiting for acknowledgement. She was waiting because the mechanism she intended to trigger would be stronger with 9 delegations than with 8, and stronger with 10 than with 9, and strongest with 11. She was letting gravity do the work. She was letting each seated delegation watch its neighbors stand and calculate, in real time, the cost of remaining in their chairs, while the recording apparatus captured their positions for the permanent record. It was, Marn recognized with a clarity that felt like something cold settling in his chest, the most sophisticated act of political maneuvering he had witnessed in 30 years of parliamentary service, and the sophistication lay in its simplicity. She had not lobbied. She had not bargained. She had not offered incentives or threatened consequences. She had placed authenticated documents on a scanner and asked one question: were you aware? The delegations were answering, one by one, and each answer was a vote, and the vote was happening without a motion, without a quorum call, without any of the procedural architecture that the Severathi had spent centuries constructing to control the pace and direction of parliamentary decisions. She was using the chamber's own weight against it. The institution was voting against itself. In the gallery, the Pelori trade analyst who had been tracking anomalies in interstellar commerce was doing a different kind of calculation. She was calculating what would happen to the Ascendancy's trade network if the Judicial Review Panel ruled the expulsion vote illegitimate and the Terran Cooperative's membership was restored. The calculation was complex because the Terran Cooperative's trade relationships, built during 14 years of exile, had created an independent economic infrastructure that did not depend on Ascendancy membership and would not dissolve if membership was restored. Humanity had not spent 14 years waiting for the Ascendancy to let them back in. Humanity had spent 14 years building an alternative. The alternative was now large enough that its existence changed the terms of any restoration. The Pelori analyst closed her tablet. She placed it face down on her thigh. The gesture was borrowed from the Torvathi, who used it for information too significant to risk being read. The Pelori borrowed gestures the way they borrowed precedents, precisely, and with full attribution. The Morathan delegate had not yet declared her awareness or unawareness. She had asked the question. She had not answered it. The Morathan measured decisions against geological time. To stand now, within minutes of the question being asked, would be hasty by Morathan standards. But the Morathan also understood, better than any species in the chamber, the concept of erosion, the slow, patient wearing away of a false surface to reveal the bedrock beneath. She stood, slowly, her body carrying the weight of a species that counted in epochs. When she was fully upright, the floor panels beneath her platform vibrated with the mass of her, and the chamber felt her decision the way a valley feels the settling of a mountain. 9. The count rippled through the gallery. In the upper tiers, aides and attaches began transmitting on secure channels, composing the messages that would reach their governments before the session's formal transcript was released. The messages were short. The diplomatic courier protocol for urgent parliamentary developments was a standardized format across most compact species. Situation, assessment, recommended posture. The situation was clear. The assessment was unanimous. The recommended posture varied, but the variance was narrowing with every delegation that stood, because the recommended posture for a government whose delegation had just declared itself deceived was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of record. In the intelligence gallery, the senior Severathi officer, the one who had been sitting very still since the chain of custody log appeared, moved for the first time. He reached into his formal jacket and extracted a slim personal communicator, the kind used for encrypted back-channel transmissions. He held it in his lap for 3 seconds, then placed it on the bench beside him without activating it. The gesture was visible to the Torvathi attaché sitting 4 rows below, who recognized it for what it was. The moment when an intelligence officer realized that the institution he served had created a situation that intelligence could not resolve. The communicator stayed dark. There was no one to call. The Orvan representative, reptilian, ancient, her clawed hands flat on the stone bench, sat with her vertical pupils fixed on the holographic display. The Orvan's alliance with the Severathi was old and deeply economic, threaded through shared trade corridors and mutual defense agreements that predated the current parliamentary session by 3 terms. To stand now was to break an alignment that her predecessors had maintained for generations. The cost of standing was measurable and immediate. The cost of remaining seated, however, was becoming measurable too, and the measurement was happening in real time, in front of recording apparatus, on diplomatic feeds watched by every intelligence service in the compact. The Orvan's advisory, a younger officer with scales that had not yet darkened to the deep olive of full maturity, placed a hand on the edge of the delegation's shared data terminal and pulled up the compact's judicial precedent index. The search took 4 seconds. The precedent was clear. In 3 prior instances over the Parliament's 400-year history, delegations that had been recorded opposing a procedural challenge later found their subsequent legislative participation subject to formal credibility review. The credibility review process was slow, public, and devastating to trade relationships. The advisory turned the terminal toward the Orvan representative. She read the precedent. Her vertical pupils contracted to thin black lines. The Orvan stood. Her claws scraped the stone bench as she rose, and the sound carried through the chamber's acoustics with a finality that made the Severathi delegation's chief advisor close her eyes. 10. The Kishan representative, whose species had evolved in high-pressure ocean trenches where reading intent was the difference between survival and predation, processed the chamber's shifting alignment through the binary logic her environment had bred into her nervous system. Every decision in the trenches was binary, adapt or be crushed. She had adapted to the Severathi block because the block had been the dominant pressure. The pressure had shifted. She could feel it in the way the other delegations' bodies were oriented, the way 1,100 faces in the gallery tiers had turned from the holographic display to the remaining seated delegations, the way the recording apparatus had adjusted its focus from the podium to the empty spaces in the ring of standing delegates. She stood. The motion was fluid and decisive, the movement of a body that had evolved to make survival decisions in the time it took a pressure wave to reach the seafloor. She did not look at Marn. She did not look at anyone. She looked at Alara, and her expression was the one her species used when they had completed an assessment and found the structural integrity of their position sound. It was not gratitude. It was not solidarity. It was the acknowledgement of competence by a species that valued competence above all other traits, because in the ocean trenches competence was the only thing that kept the water from crushing you. 11. Marn's chief advisor, the younger Severathi officer, placed her hand on the consul's forearm. The gesture was unprecedented in a recorded session. Severathi protocol prohibited physical contact between delegation members during formal proceedings, because physical contact implied a level of emotional involvement that undermined institutional objectivity. The advisor did it anyway. Her hand rested on Marn's arm for 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds the advisory relationship between them shifted from institutional to personal, and the shift was permanent, and the recording apparatus captured it, and the diplomatic analysts who would review the transcript would note it and understand exactly what it meant. The advisor was no longer advising the consul. She was comforting a colleague who had lost. Marn did not acknowledge the touch. His eye membranes were closed. His hands were flat on the stone. His breathing, which the Severathi respiratory system rendered silent, had slowed to the rate that his species' autonomic nervous system adopted during situations classified as structurally irrecoverable. The Sharathi delegation's representative, young, recently appointed, visibly uncomfortable, sat in his chair and stared at the floor. He had inherited a political alignment he had not chosen. The alignment ran through his predecessor, who had aligned with Marn's predecessor, who had aligned with the intelligence director whose name was now glowing in authenticated chain of custody logs on the holographic display above his head. He looked at the Severathi delegation. Marn did not look back. The Sharathi representative looked at the floor for 4 more seconds. Then he stood. 12-1, except it was not 12. It was 11 because Marn's delegation was the Severathi delegation, and the Severathi delegation did not stand. 11 delegations stood, 1 sat. And the one that sat was the delegation whose intelligence service had manufactured the fraud, whose predecessor's chief of staff had ordered the suppression, whose institutional architecture had been built on the foundation that was now crumbling on the holographic display in full view of every diplomatic feed in the compact. Marn sat alone. The consul's bench, designed to project authority through its elevation and its placement at the chamber's eastern wall, now projected something else entirely. It projected isolation. A single Severathi consul, seated in dark stone, surrounded by 11 standing delegations and a human woman who had not raised her voice once. "I move," Alara said, "for a procedural challenge under Section 47 of the Foundational Compact. I present the standing of 11 participating delegations as the required threshold." The parliamentary clerk's memory organ processed the request. His elongated skull tilted slightly, held for 3 seconds, then straightened. "The motion is procedurally valid. 11 participating delegations exceed the 2/3 threshold required under Section 47. The motion is automatically referred to the Judicial Review Panel. No vote of the presiding consul is required. No override mechanism exists." The words fell into the chamber like stones dropped into still water. No vote required. No override. The mechanism had been triggered, and the mechanism was self-executing, and the institution that had built it 400 years ago had never imagined it would be used against the institution itself. Marn stood from the consul's bench. His composure had not broken. It had, instead, frozen into something harder and more brittle, the composure of a man who understood that the ground beneath his authority had shifted, and that any movement might cause it to give way entirely. "This parliament will not be manipulated by a species it expelled," he said. The formal cadence was gone. What remained was personal. "This parliament is not being manipulated," Alara said. "It is being held to its own laws." She did not add anything else. She did not explain. She did not elaborate. The distinction between manipulation and accountability was visible to every delegation in the chamber, audible in the recording apparatus, and legible to every diplomatic analyst who would review the session transcript in the hours and days and decades to come. Adding words would have diminished it. The Morathan delegate made a sound, low, resonant, old, a sound her species made when they recognized a pattern reasserting itself after a long dormancy. The Morathan word for it translated roughly as the shape that returns. It meant a geological structure resuming its original form after external pressure was removed. The pattern in this case was accountability. It had been buried under 14 years of institutional convenience, and now the burial was over and the shape was returning. Through the glass dome overhead, the daytime sky of Severath Prime stretched in pale blue, and high in that sky, barely visible against the atmospheric haze, The running lights of 4 Terran vessels held station in a formation that was not military, not aggressive, not threatening. It was the formation Terran ships used for diplomatic escort. They had been there for 9 days. The Parliament had not acknowledged them. The Ascendancy's official position was that the vessels were conducting routine navigational exercises. The navigational exercises had not moved the vessels a single degree of arc in 9 days. The message was not complicated. It was, we are here, and we are not leaving, and we are watching. The permanent exclusion decree, which Marn had been 3 seconds from sealing into the parliamentary record, was now suspended pending judicial review panel examination. The review would take time. The panel had to be convened, the evidence examined, the procedural record audited. But time, Alara knew, worked differently when the truth was in the open. Truth did not need to be fast. It only needed to be present. And it was present now, authenticated and displayed and recorded and visible to every diplomatic feed in Ascendancy space, where it would remain, because the recording was part of the parliamentary record, and the parliamentary record was permanent. Alara did not press. She did not deliver a speech about justice or suffering or the 14 years of exile that had ground her species Galactic standing into powder. The temptation was there. She could feel it in the muscles of her jaw, in the words cued behind her teeth, in the 14 years of correspondence conducted from station rooms that smelled of recycled air and underfunded environmental filters. The years of coded messages passed through Varenthi intermediaries. The years of collecting documents from sources who risked their careers to provide them. The years of verifying each document until the verification became a kind of meditation. A practice of patience that had no end point except the one she was standing at now. She let the temptation pass. The most dangerous thing a human could do in a room full of aliens who had wronged her was to explain herself. Explanation invited debate. Debate invited delay. Delay was the instrument of institutions that preferred their mistakes to remain undisturbed. She turned from the podium. She walked back up the center aisle, the same flat-soled shoes striking the same polished quartz, the same measured cadence. The aisle was 90 meters long. She used every meter. Behind her, 11 delegations were standing, and 1 was not, and the chamber's acoustics carried the sound of robes rustling, of chairs being pushed back, of voices beginning conversations that would reshape the next decade of interstellar governance. The record will reflect, the parliamentary clerk said, his harmonics neutral and precise, that 11 of 12 participating delegations have affirmed the procedural challenge under Section 47. The referral to the Judicial Review Panel is confirmed. The permanent exclusion decree is suspended pending review. This session is adjourned. The holographic seal of the Ascendancy Parliament dimmed and stopped rotating. The recording apparatus powered down with a series of soft clicks that sounded, in the chamber's acoustics, like tumblers in a lock falling into a new configuration. The glass dome continued to admit the pale daylight, and through it the 4 Terran escort vessels maintained their formation, patient and unhurried and still. The corridor beyond the chamber was empty. The spire's service level was a utilitarian space, all composite paneling and recessed lighting, designed for the movement of staff and materials rather than the impression of visitors. Alara's flat-soled shoes made a different sound on the composite, softer, without the resonance the quartz chamber floor had provided. She walked the corridor alone for 30 meters before the sound of her own footsteps registered as something other than background noise. It registered as quiet. The specific quiet of a person who had just done the thing they had spent 14 years preparing to do, and was now in the interval between the doing and the understanding of what had been done. Her hands were steady. They had been steady throughout the session, steady at the podium, steady placing each wafer on the scanner, steady in their refusal to gesture or emphasize or perform any of the physical rhetoric that other species use to supplement their arguments. The steadiness had not been natural. It had been practiced. She had practiced it in the rented offices, standing at makeshift podiums constructed from shipping crates, placing data wafers on flat surfaces, and speaking to empty rooms, rehearsing the cadence and the pauses and the discipline of letting silence carry the weight that words would have weakened. She had practiced it until the practice became the person, until the woman standing at the podium was not performing composure but inhabiting it, and the distinction mattered, because 1,200 delegates from 12 species with 12 different systems for reading deception would have detected a performance. What they had detected instead was something they had no framework for, a human who had been wronged and who had responded not with anger or force, but with 14 years of meticulous, patient, unrelenting preparation. The preparation was the anger. The patience was the force. The distinction was human, and the aliens in that chamber would spend years trying to understand it. Silith Khan fell into step beside her. The Varentha's palms were open at her sides, still reading, still processing the emotional residue of what had happened in the chamber. They walked in silence for 20 meters, the corridor curving gently toward the spire's external transit platform. "Your predecessor was right," Ilara said. "She told me before she died," Silith said. "She said, they will come back, and when they do, they will not come with weapons. They will come with the truth, and the truth will be quiet, and the quiet will be the loudest thing the room has ever heard." Ilara almost smiled. The expression did not quite reach her mouth, but it reached her eyes, and Silith, whose palms were reading the emotional frequencies of the woman standing before her, felt it as a low, steady warmth that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the stubborn, grinding, immovable refusal to accept that a wrong done 14 years ago would remain wrong forever. The transit platform was ahead. Through its transparent canopy, the pale sky of Severath Prime stretched toward the horizon, and the 4 Terran escort vessels were visible as pinpoints of steady light against the atmospheric haze. They had not moved. They would not move. They would hold station until the Judicial Review panel convened, and through the review, and through the ruling, and through whatever came after. Patience was not a strategy. It was a species trait, and it was the one trait, out of all the traits the galaxy found terrifying about humanity, that the Ascendancy had most fatally underestimated. In the chamber, Marn sat alone. The pale daylight from the dome fell across his face, illuminating the rigid lines of his composure, the stillness of his hands, the closed membranes of his secondary eyes. The seats emptied around him. The recording apparatus was dark. The holographic display was off. But the 2 assessments, with their identical titles and opposite conclusions, were already in the parliamentary record, and the parliamentary record was permanent. And permanence was a weight that even the Severathi, who had built their entire civilization on the architecture of institutional control, could not lift. He sat there for a long time. The dome's daylight shifted as Severath Prime's sun tracked across the sky. The 4 Terran vessels did not move. Nobody came to tell him what to do next. For the first time in his career, the institution had no instructions for him. The mechanism his predecessors had built 400 years ago, designed to protect the Parliament from external threats, had been turned inward by a woman who understood it better than the people who sat inside it, and who had walked out of the chamber with the unhurried gait of someone who had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. The Ascendancy Parliament had spent 14 years pretending that humanity did not exist. Humanity had spent those 14 years preparing for the moment the pretending stopped. The difference was now a matter of public record, and the public record, unlike the intelligence assessments that had started everything, could not be classified, sealed, or removed. Ilara Voss had not come to this chamber to win an argument. She had come to place the truth on a surface where it could not be moved, and then she had walked away and let the surface hold it. It always did, given time. And time was the one thing she had never been short of.